Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us for Artificial Intelligence and Machine Learning and Software as a Medical Device with Laureano Gagliotti. He is our speaker for this session, and he's going to take it away.
Thank you. Thank you for the introduction. Many of you know me already. I'm Laureano Gagliotti. I work at the Food and Drug Administration in the Center for Devices and Radiological Health. And my day-to-day job is to review medical devices, in particular ECG-based medical devices. So I'm giving you a brief overview of this type of devices from an FDA perspective, from a device review perspective. In particular, we're talking about artificial intelligence and machine learning in a software as a medical device. It is important to remember that all the examples in this talk are pictures, and we don't have a specific guidance document for this type of devices. And this presentation is not intended to be a guidance document. I'm going to give you a few examples. I'm going to oversimplify a lot of stuff, but stay with me. So first of all, a little bit of terminology. A software as a medical device is defined as a software to be used for medical purposes that is not part of an hardware medical device. Also important to define that machine learning, artificial intelligence are really not so well defined in general. There is a little bit of gray area in terminology, and so in general, I'm going to talk about, I'm going to call everything machine learning, and just for this presentation, and it will include machine learning, artificial intelligence, and everything where you have an algorithm that learn from data. I am also going to use machine learning in contrast with a rule-based algorithm, when basically you have a set of rules from a consensus, for example, and you implement that in your device. And machine learning, artificial intelligence algorithms can be locked, or they can continuously learn from data. Just for simplicity, we are talking about locked algorithms in this case, because that's what's common in the current regulatory framework, but we will touch later on this aspect. In addition to that, let me define an algorithm as a combination of a technique and the data that is going to be implemented in a final finished device. For simplicity, because I'm not very good in saying algorithm, I would say device, and I'm meaning an algorithm that is implemented in a software medical device or software as a medical device. And there is a little bit of confusion in nomenclature. Academia tend to use for machine learning devices, academia trained to talk about training and then validation. You do these steps again and again until you are satisfied, and then you have your final testing on your device. In regulatory world, we use same terms in a different meaning. So I will go and call training any activity that you do before locking your device, and then validation when you have an independent data set and use it to get the real world performance on your locked device in this case. And of course, examples would be based on cardiac diagnostics, so arrhythmia detection, ECG classification, and so forth. Let's take an example then. We define some intended use and characteristics for this device. This is a device that is going to be used in hospital and clinics by experts, cardiologists, to analyze the resting traveling ECGs. And this device is going to have a lot of outputs. These outputs are diagnostic statements like AMI, LVH, LVP, and so forth. Each one is, in my discussion, I will consider each one an output, but we'll just focus on AMI just for simplicity of discussing. When we have, so we have two options, basically. We have a rule-based algorithm where we have a feature extraction and a set of rules, and then we have an output. Or we can have a fully machine learning device where we have a black box that analyzes an ECG and gives us an output. And it's not black and white. I mean, there is a continuum of different options that you can have. You can do a little bit, a few intermediate steps with machine learning, or you can just do everything with machine learning. In this example, we will talk just about a complete machine learning just for simplicity's sake. So what is a machine learning algorithm in this case? You take a bunch of data, 4.2 gazillion messages. You pick the model. I picked the Parmigian AI network with 214 million Zani per layer and 5 layers and a bunch of nodes and so forth. Then I compute it. I compute it for like 7.5 million seconds computational time, and I do a lot of iteration, and then I'm satisfied, and I lock it. And then I put it in my device. So just to remember, algorithm is the combination of all them. In a regulatory submission, you may really want to clarify that you are using machine learning. You want to describe what is this model that you use, the data that you use, and describe the role of machine learning within your complete device. And then you may need, you really must include validation data to demonstrate device performance, demonstrate safety and effectiveness. And it's in particular important to remember that if you change the model or the data, or if you retrain, we consider this algorithm changes. You may or may not need to submit a new submission. That's defined by some guidances, and we can just talk about it briefly later on. I say that it is important to have a good validation. Let's see why. So say that you have a rule-based algorithm that is usually done by having some feature extracted, like you measure heart rate, QRS, classify beats, and so forth. Then you have a set of clinical rules. For example, you open the fourth universal definition of myocardial infarction. Is an expert consensus, seems trustable enough. And what you do, you take this and pick up a rule for AMI, and the rule is here. You can set. So if you have a machine learning algorithm, you basically did your training of your model based on your data set, and you have an output. What about the rule? So in this case of the fourth universal definition, there is a bunch of rules about what to look at the elevation in men more than 4 years old, less than 4 years old, and so forth. What do we know about the rules that are implemented in your device? We don't know if differentiated by age or by sex. We don't even know if they're using the same numbers, the same rules. We don't know if they look at the same leads the same way. We don't really know if they look at the contiguous leads, or if they really look at the J point, or if they exclude LVH or LBB. So we don't really know anything about this rule. And what we need to base our evaluation on is really how this device performs in real world. So to do that, we will talk about a little bit later about that. What is the type of validation data that we see usually? For traditional ECG devices, for traditional arrhythmia detectors, usually, we have seen traditionally used the C57 database. It was a C57 standard that it was based on databases available like 20, 40 years ago. And it includes like 260 something records for 14 classes. If we compare that with other research databases for machine learning oriented, we see that numbers are very different. A database for handwriting 10 classes is composed by 70,000 images, and more larger more extended image recognition can go in the millions of images. So we see usually machine learning requires a little bit more data. What is the important characteristic of the data that we use for validation? That this data needs to be representative of the signal that we are going to see in real world. So we need to have the same lead location, same lead number. We need to work on the same electrode technology. For example, wet electrodes versus dry electrodes that we know tend to be a little bit more noisy. We need to have same or similar sampling frequency, resolution, filtering, and then record duration, snapshot versus like 24-hour recording, use condition, resting ECG versus an ambulatory patient that maybe is walking or running, that maybe a different amount of artifacts, for example, are used at home, hospital transport, special environment. And also we want to have a representative population for our conditions. We want to have a representative disease conditions. We want to have representative demographic and ethnicity. And we also want to have other confounders represented properly if these are relevant. And also important, we want to have enough sample size from a statistical and clinical standpoint to be able to draw meaningful conclusions. And just a side note here, if you have a beats and ECG snippets from the same patient, should not be considered independent each other. You have like 100 beats from the same patients is usually just one data point or slightly more than one. Other considerations that that we should take in account for validation. We want to have a well-annotated ground truth or reference standard, whatever you want to call it. So we want to know the truth, usually by clinical evaluation. And we want to have a representative sample of disease severity, for example, other diseases, confounders. It is probably helpful to have contextual information. We have seen, for example, AMI criteria differ by sex, by age, and so forth. Sometimes there are some racial confounders, so you want to have this information available as much as possible. It may be okay to do numerical transformation. For example, if you have a patch device, you can transform a 12-lead ECG to the signal close enough to what we'll see from a patch. It is important, please do not use synthetic or artificial ECGs for validation. We want to see real ECGs because, I mean, the simulators are good, but not that good. Arrange data sets where you have the disease prevalence to be not the same as normal population are usually fine for ECG. It's very common to have usually ECGs are mostly normal. It's very common to have validation data sets where non-normal are overrepresented. That's completely fine. It is fine to have a validation that is composed by multiple data sets. Usually that's acceptable. It is important to keep training and validation data separate. So use different size as much as possible, at least use different times. So you stop recording for training and then from a standpoint, you just record for validation. Avoid random splitting between training and validation, and make sure that you have good data segregation techniques and well documented. It is usually acceptable to have reasonable and documented data reuse. So it's not that the user validation data set once and that's fine. I mean, you can reuse it, of course. Don't reuse it 1,000 times because that you get in the overtraining, overfitting of your validation data. So what to report? What is relevant as a metric report? It really depends on the intended use, but usually we think it's important to report sensitivity, important to report specificity or positive predictive value, depending on what type of analysis you're doing. If you are using a rich population, please adjust the PPV. for the real disease prevalence. In some cases, it's also important to report false alarm rate estimated on realistic use of the device, for example, for bedside monitors, or when you do repeated testing. It is also, in many cases, helpful to report the confusion metrics, so we can see where misclassified ECGs are bucketed. We usually don't see very relevant to report the negative predictive value just because the disease prevalence is very low and negative predictive value is usually 90-something%, even if the device doesn't work very well. F1 score is not that important in our experience. Error secure is, again, not that important because usually you have a yes, no, so you don't have, I mean, that's not very helpful. Also, qualitative analysis is really not that useful. So some consideration to evaluate the results. The results should be evaluated in the context of intended use and technological characteristics. Each of the outputs, AMI, AF, VT, VF, everything should be evaluated and have a decent sample size. Sample size decent from a statistical and clinical standpoint. Usually we suggest having confidence intervals, in particular for machine learning devices, just to support that the sample size is sufficient. And then your performance should be good. We recommend to report all results in case of composite data set, report separated, combined. We recommend either you have a good performance goal and you meet them, and if you have few cases where you're a little bit lower, maybe fine to discuss and to justify them. It is also probably a good idea to remove the outputs that are not performing very well. I mean, if you get a 20% sensitivity, usually there is not much to discuss there. I mean, it's probably just not a good idea to have in your device. In machine learning, we also recommend to perform and discuss subgroup analysis because it's helpful to demonstrate that the device performs well across the range of the intended users and population. So what is an example of how the intended use may impact what's your performance requirements? For example, that's really I just put some data here. Say that you have a 12-lead diagnostic ECG for cardiologists, then you set a default threshold 85% sensitivity and specificity PV. You may want to set an higher threshold like 90%, for example, for high-risk condition like AMI, STEMI, and so forth. If you have the same device, but now you want to give it to a nurse to do a pre-scanning in a remote area, then you may want to have better performance. So you may want to have sensitivity of 95% while keeping specificity of 85%. You may want to increase even further the sensitivity requirement for low risk, for high risk condition like AMI, because you don't want to miss any of these patients because they may go to die if not treated properly. So similarly, if you have a bedside monitor, you can set the same default threshold 85%, but in this case, you may want to have higher thresholds for asystole, VF, and all the other conditions where you may want to have a prompt intervention at 95 or 99% in this case, for example. You also want to set some thresholds for false alarm rate in this case, because you don't want to alarm 50 times a day for each patient, because nurses are not going to be really happy about that. If you give a device to the patient, for example, an over-the-counter device or a device for patient use, say that you have an defibrillation detector, it's probably a situation where you want to have fairly high threshold for sensitivity. I'm saying here 98%, because you don't want to give incorrect information to the patients because they may not be able to really understand what's going on. They may fail to seek physician. They may or they may get stressed because of the false alarms. And you also may want to have a low false alarm rate. For example, in this case, I put like 5% per patient per year. So we see a lot of excitation in the AI and machine learning applied to ECG. We have seen a lot of presentation. We're going to see a lot of presentation in CVC, a lot of press release and groups working on these aspects. If you're planning to submit a submission to FDA for your device that you want to market, if you have any question, ask us. You can submit, you can send me an email, or you can send an email to any other review division. If you have a complex, if it is an easy answer, is an easy question, we probably can answer you by email. If it's a more complex question, we will tell you to submit a pre-submission. That's free, and we have a way to provide you a good feedback. I also say that we talk about locked machine learning because that's what is our current review framework. We usually review final finished devices. So sort of by definition, they're locked. You can modify your device. You can retrain your device. There are guidances that tell you when you need to submit a new 15K submission. In the future, we may see more continuously learning machine learning devices. There are a few examples now for high-risk devices, mostly in the imaging field, but FDA is working on a future framework, future regulatory framework. There is an action plan that was published a couple of years ago. There is an updated action plan published like a few months ago. And basically, it's possible that in the future we will have a way to predefine some modification plans, and as long as we stay in that, you may be able to do continuous learning and continuous improvement. That's the future. Right now, that's not possible. And then I think it's also important to have a synergy between regulatory world, academia, and industry. I think that is important if everybody works together to have a new training data set, so academia can work on new things, new stuff, new exciting things. It is also important to have new validation data sets. We need large, well-annotated, and publicly available validation data sets. There is a program in the Food and Drug Administration. It's called Medical Device Development Tool certification, I think it's called, and that allow the agency to say, okay, this data set is good for this purpose and can be used in regulatory submissions to demonstrate that your device is good enough. And there are a couple of folks in the audience, I think, that are working on new data sets, and we hope to see more of these data sets developed, possibly certified and used. And then it's also important for the academic community to work on some aspects that are not as fancy as I'm creating a new machine learning artificial intelligence thingy, but they're also very important for us figuring out what is the optimal validation. We don't want to ask too much validation data, but we also want to be sure about what is going to be on the market. And we also like to have a better understanding about the effects of automation bias and how artificial intelligence are used by users. So how is this is interaction with this new technology? And FDA is working on a lot of these initiatives. Stay tuned, check for new guidances, check for these new AI machine learning updates. Something that you want to comment, something that can be done better, use the comments. I mean, there is a public commenting period. You can use the docket and you can comment and somebody will read your feedback. Not necessarily do something with that, but at least read. And then a little bit of reading. There are a lot of guidances that say not specific guidance, but a lot of guidances that can be applicable for this type of devices. This is just an example of guidances literature about some methods. And I think my presentation is over. And if you have any question, please, I'm here. to respond as much as I can.
Thank you, Laureano. Yeah, we've got a few questions that have come in. So I'll take them in the order. So Johan asked the first question, is a prospectively acquired data set always necessary to validate a complete black box machine language-based algorithm?
Not necessarily. If you have, usually it's usually a good idea to do it, of course. But as long as you have a good rationale, and if your data seems good enough, in the sense, like as a validation data set, it seems to be reliable enough, and you have good rationale to support that, and if you can demonstrate that you maintain the segregation from any other validation activity, from any other development and training activity, is something that we have seen. I think, yes, not necessarily. Again, that's the easiest way to do it, right? If you do it prospectively. But we understand the challenges to do that.
Okay, thank you. So Jürgen Canters asked, could it be an idea that the FDA or ISKI maintain a closed database that companies could send their algorithms against and get the overall results?
That would be great and ideal. That's not happening so far. But FDA is open to this kind of discussions, and there are I think Jean-Philippe and USCF, they are working on something on this type of idea. And sure, if we can do that, definitely there is this MDDT pathway that allows potentially FDA to evaluate that and decide that it's good enough for validation for any future device. But it's not easy task because you need a lot of data and well validated. So that's usually where is the issue.
Sure. Yeah. It seems like that would be a really good thing for ISKI to be involved with, and then, make sure that it would be acceptable to the FDA.
Yeah. That would be great. And we can discuss more about that, but yes, we will be very, very glad about that.
Sure. So Jeffrey Mitchell asked, is it acceptable to include generated data, for example, from a GAN, to augment an imbalanced outcome in a training set?
For training, yes. For validation, not really. I think we usually strongly don't recommend using artificial data for validation. And I think it's because we do not have enough confidence on the way you get this artificial validation data. So we don't really consider that good enough for a device validation.
Sure, that makes sense. So it's okay for the training, but not the testing.
Yeah, for training, yes. For what we are concerned, in the end, we look at the device as like a black box. You did something, you get something that seems to work. Okay, feed some data and see how it works. And
sure.
I think in this context, I talked before about there is a sort of continuum between purely rule-based and full artificial intelligence or machine learning devices. It is quite possible and quite commonly done to leverage some of this additional information about what's inside, how you trained, and what this device is looking at to reduce the burden of having a validation. So instead of having very complete millions of SDGs to validate, you may validate with less.
Yep. Okay. And then finally, Joel Shu asks, it has to do with over-the-counter versus manufacturers, ones that are for in-hospital care. So over-the-counter devices usually just a first check remind with compromised signal quality, typically followed by another check. So why would the FDA expect much higher accuracy than in a hospital device?
That's a consideration of how is the impact of a device incorrect output. And let me specify that it is fine if your device tells you, I mean, I cannot say anything about this signal, take it again. We don't consider that a failure. That can be a failure for a bedside monitor, for example, because you don't want to miss a VF event because your device say that it's noise. In a spot check over-the-counter device, may be good to when your device is not sure, it may be good to say that's noise again. I think is more important to have good performance when you give an output, because then your patient is going to do stuff that it's going to check a physician or say, oh, I'm fine, depending on the output. So I think is where we try to take in consideration the use case and with what we expect. I mean, what is the use of the information and how is the capacity of the user to double check the information, to verify the information. So that's why I suggest that if you have a spot check for patients, you may want to have better performance. And I mean, these numbers, I mean, I just made up these numbers, but these are what we see in recent devices. This is the range of recent devices that we have seen.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Laureano. It's the top of the hour. We will move on, and we will end this broadcast and start up with the next speaker momentarily. Thank you.
Thank you.